Good afternoon. I will now call the April 8th, 2025 Ben Lapine Schools Budget Committee meeting to order. I would like to introduce our participants this evening. Budget Committee Vice Chair Natasha McFarland, Ned Lutz, Sharon Beluski, Seth Eisenberg, Chief Financial Officer Dan Emerson, Assistant Director of Finance Budget Nick Sheen, Board Chair Marcus LeGrand, Director Amy Tatum, Director Shirley Olson, Director Ross Tomlin, Superintendent Dr. Steve Cook, Deputy Superintendent Dr. Lisa Burke, and Board Clerk Janet Bojanowski, and I am Kara Marsh Rhodes, Chair of the Budget Committee. Moving on to review of the agenda. Dr. Cook, are there any changes to the agenda?
There are no changes to the agenda.
Fellow committee members, are there any changes to the agenda? Hearing no requests for changes, we'll proceed with the agenda as noticed. At this time, I will entertain a motion for the 2025-2026 Budget Committee Chair. Are there any nominations, motions for nominations?
I move to nominate Kara Marsh Rhodes as our chair.
Any others? Are there other nominations? Okay, hearing none, is there a second to that nomination?
I'll second.
Who was that? Tasha McFarland has made the motion and Amy Tatum seconded the motion. I will now call for a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Abstentions? Okay, with a unanimous vote,
Kara, you'll need to abstain.
I abstain
Yes.
from voting.
You can't vote for yourself.
That makes sense. Okay, with a vote with most in favor and one abstention, me, Kara Marsh Rhodes, I am the 2025-26 Budget Committee Chair. Oh, Vice Chair. Okay, at this time, I'll entertain a motion for the Budget Committee Vice Chair. Are there nominations?
I'll nominate Natasha McFarland as Budget Committee Vice Chair.
I'll second that motion.
Other nominations? Okay. I'm sorry, who made the motion?
It's
Thank
Amy.
you.
Amy made the motion, Marcus seconded.
Thank you. Amy Tatum has made the motion and Marcus LeGrand seconded the motion. Now I'll call for a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Any abstentions? With a vote, with one abstention and the rest in favor, Tasha McFarland is the 2025-2026 Budget Committee Vice Chair. Thank you. Moving on to public comment section of the agenda. We did not have anybody sign up to provide public comment. At this time, we'll hear from Superintendent Cook for the budget message, followed by Dan Emerson, Chief Financial Officer, with the proposed 2025-26 budget document.
Thank you, Chair Marsh Rhodes. Esteemed members of the Budget Committee and community members, as we start the budget process for the 25-26 school year, it is vital that we reflect on whether or not we have delivered upon the commitments we've made as good stewards of our taxpayers' dollars. Whether we are using taxpayer dollars for staffing, providing updated instructional materials, or enhancing our infrastructure, we take the responsibility of stewardship and community engagement very seriously at Ben Lapine Schools in our endeavor of providing comprehensive educational experience to our students. Deciding how to spend public dollars in service of the district goals is done with intentionality, public input, and feedback. We have historically built our budget on the promise that each Ben Lapine School student is known by name, strength, and need, and graduates ready for college, career, and life. Additionally, we strive for students, staff, and families to thrive in the Ben Lapine schools. To this end, we have established 4 organizational goals that serve as the true north for our system. Goal 1, students develop a strong academic foundation. Goal 2, students have a passion, purpose, and a plan for their future. Goal 3, students, families, and staff experience inclusion and belonging. And Goal 4, operational systems align and support an academically effective and sustainable organization. Of significance this year, we are recommending to continue the work of the District Culture and Climate Task Force, composed of classroom educators, support staff, and building and district administrators to collaboratively tackle some of our most pressing needs in our schools, such as agreed upon common best practices, a consistent and transparent approach to supporting positive and productive classroom environments. We've also committed to ongoing stakeholder engagement through surveys, advisories, student and staff feedback. These collaborative conversations continue to provide invaluable insight into how we can better support our students and our staff to optimize learning experiences with the fiscal constraints imposed by the state funding formula. Also, as a part of the integrated planning process required by the Oregon Department of Education, and to ensure alignment with community expectations, we've engaged in substantive discussions with students and families across the district to assess our progress ensuring student success. Are we focusing on the right factors with the greatest impact on student success? Are we truly preparing graduates for the demands of college, career, and civic engagement? Are our systems the most effective and efficient that they can be to produce the outcomes our families and community want and expects for our students? These are the questions that require our collective attention. The 25-26 budget is appropriated to reflect that feedback, refining our use of resources to provide the best learning environment for students in Ben Lapine schools. Finally, I'm also pleased to confirm that this proposed budget is balanced and adheres to the requirements outlined in Ben Lapine Schools Executive Limitation 4.3, Financial Planning and Administration. This policy requires proposing a budget with an ending fund balance of at least equal to 5% of resources in the general fund operating budget. We are truly grateful for your ongoing support of the Ben Lapine Schools. In collaborative partnership, Dr. Stephen Cook.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. All right, now, for the record, Dan Emerson, Chief Financial Officer, and I'm joined here with Nick Shane, Assistant Director of Finance of Budget. And we're going to be going through a quick presentation here on the 25, kind of an overview of the 25-26 budget. I know in the past that we have done line item by line item, and we've also kind of gone through the budget assumptions. This will be a little bit of both in a presentation format. So we look forward to doing that. Before we get going here, I just wanted to acknowledge and thank our budget committee, our resident budget committee members. We know that this is a volunteer position. You guys take time out of your day. It's a busy time, and then you go through our budget to make sure that it's transparent and available for the community. So thank you very much for that. And of course, thank you to our board as well. So moving forward. So for today's agenda, we'll go over budget assumptions, kind of the core budget assumptions that are built into the FY 25-26 proposed budget. And then we'll go through the revenue assumptions, specifically our largest revenue sources, and then move into expenditures, talk about personnel, which is roughly 85% of our expenditures. And then we'll talk about the difference between the requested and proposed budget, the changes we made, and the forecast and future years outlook. And as we go through this, after each slide, I'll stop and ask if there's any questions from the full budget committee. Okay. All right, so first up, why are budget assumptions necessary? Well, largely speaking, they're necessary because we do not have actual numbers for all of our major kind of players in terms of revenue and expenditure. So it is the first year of the state biennial budget. And so at this point in time, they have not passed the state school fund allocation, and so that's still up in the air. So there's an uncertainty around the final state school fund allocation, which we'll be referring to throughout this presentation as SSF funding. And so we are making an assumption there. We've also made assumptions regarding federal funding. Federal funding remains unclear, volatile at this point in time, so we've made some assumptions as to what our title funding will come in. And we also recognize that potential federal cuts to other areas of the state budget, such as the Health and Human Services budget, would likely have ripple effects on K-12 education as well. And that would be because Health and Human Services is actually the largest state budget, excuse me. Finally, we have some very important expenditure assumptions that we've put into this budget document. They're not finalized yet because we are in the middle of bargaining for compensation, and so those compensation articles include our COLA, our cost of living assumption, and the insurance cap. So we've put those into the budget as an estimate at this point in time. Are there any questions around assumptions and why we've put those in at this point? Okay. So let's start off with a little bit of a review on revenue assumptions. The state school fund. The state school fund revenue is based off state revenues plus local property taxes appropriated towards the K-12 budget. There are some funding carve-outs for specific programs, such as the high-cost disability grant. And other grants, the high-cost disability grant is a grant for SPED individuals who cost more than $30,000 a year. So that's a carve-out off the top. After the carve-out, ESDs get their portion, and then the remaining funding is distributed to districts based on student enrollment counts. Our percentage of the funding is based on our student enrollment compared to total enrollment of all K-12 students across the state. And we estimate our percentage to be about 2.9% or flat since fiscal year 24-25. If some of you have gone through the budget, you've probably noticed that we're projecting a slight decrease of about 200 and so enrollment. However, that is the trend across all of Oregon right now. So that's why we are making the assumption that our overall relative portion of that SSF funding will remain flat. Any questions? Okay. So a little bit more detail on the state school fund. The state school fund is 96% of our total general fund operations revenue. So that's obviously a very large portion, and so it's really important that we get these numbers right in our budget. Our fiscal year 25-26 proposed budget includes an estimate of $11.6 billion in the statewide SSF allocation. And that roughly translates to about $229 million for Ben Lapine schools in the first year of the biennium. The Ways and Means Committee has approved $11.4 billion for the state school fund. And so there is a $200 million gap between our budget assumption right now and where we are currently at the statewide, which translates to about a $3 million gap in our proposed budget between revenues and what's been approved by the Ways and Means Committee. However, there are two bills going through related to additional high-cost grant and additional SPED double weight, increasing the IEP cap. And we anticipate that those will be passed, or at least one of those would be passed, which would push us up to $11.6 billion in revenue. And those are still in the revenue committees at this point in time. Any questions related to that or anything anybody would like to add?
Question.
Yes, Director Olson.
The current weight for special ed kids is 1.5, is that correct?
I believe it's 1.0. So you get a credit for the student as they're enrolled, and then you get another 1.0 credit.
It is a full one.
It's a
Okay,
whole
yeah.
double
Thank you.
weight, correct.
Up to 2, right?
But it's also capped.
It's capped at 11% right now. Yeah. And so that is exactly what we're talking about here. The bill that's in the House is to increase that cap or get rid of that cap. And so right now we're capped at 11% of students, but actually we have 12.3% of our students would qualify as SPED on an IEP plan. And so we estimate that that would be a couple hundred, that would be about another $2.5 million in revenue for us. And then we estimate that the SPED would be about $500,000. The high cost disability grant would be about another 2.5. And so that's how we come up with 11.6 billion.
And just another reminder that the state school fund also has a cap on the total amount of weightings that any one student can be funded for.
I have a question. Should either of those bills fail to pass, what is our contingency plan?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Just under 2% if I'm doing my math right?
We would have to, and as we go through the presentation, I'll dive more into that, but we would, just to kind of skip to the end, we'd have to make reductions to be able to cover that. All right, moving on to revenue assumptions, SIA. So SIA is the Student Investment Account Grant. It is the largest grant revenue source that we have. This is state funding. The fiscal year 25-26 proposed budget includes an estimate of $16.6 million in SIA funding. This is only a 1.7% increase year over year in SIA resources. And so the increase is actually not sufficient to cover the increased cost of personnel in fiscal year 25-26, because generally speaking, we had a 9% increase in personnel. So to retain staff in this grant, we either move the FTE to other grants and materials, or we reduce the appropriations, we reduce materials and services appropriations district-wide. So basically, we made some cuts relating to materials and services, which we'll be getting into as well.
Dan, I'd like to jump in and editorialize on that as well. I just want to draw attention to the fact that the proposed increase is 1.7%. When we know and understand our roll-up costs, 85 to 86% of our dollars go to people. And when those increase annually from year to year, those increased personnel costs are in the 9% range. And we are funding, almost all of the SIA funds are going towards positions. And the funding model increases at 1.7%. And the personnel costs, the drop-down costs that we have to maintain for those positions are 9%. That means we have to assume those costs back in the general fund, which you're going to hear a recurring kind of theme from us, that every time we have to absorb that in the general fund, think of that as a tax on the general fund. That impacts our ability to add more programs, more resources, more people, and supports to our system.
Mm-hmm. And as we get farther in the presentation, you'll see that ultimately we weren't able to absorb that cost. We had to reduce all the way around the edges to make this budget balanced, and so we'll get into that. Moving on, we'll move on to our High School Success Grant, which is approximately $5 million. That's the proposed number this year. It's actually a 1% decrease in funding in the High School Success Grant from last year, and so we're running into the same thing that Dr. Cook was talking about. Personnel in that grant increased by 9%, but of course the funding went down by 1%. So we had to cut a lot of materials and services, supplies, things of that nature out of the High School Success Grant, and we had to cut it out of the general fund as a whole to make room and retain those staff effectively. Questions? Our last revenue assumptions here are other major grants, and we'll touch on federal funding. So federal funding does appear uncertain and it remains volatile. We just can't quite pin down exactly where things are going to land, especially with our title funds. And we have budgeted Title I and III funds to remain flat in fiscal year 2025-26. The proposed 25-26 budget, however, does remove Title II and Title IV funds. And so that's $500,000. And this is, our best estimate, listening to COSA, listening to the people at the state legislature and what the state legislation and what they're saying. So IDEA funds appear to be able to sustain current service levels, which is good news. So they'll be able to continue to have all the staff that were currently in them. The governor's budget proposed a large increase in revenue to the early literacy grant. So that's a state grant. It's approximately a $900,000 increase, which thankfully offsets about half of the lack of funding in SIA and HSS. So we are able to move staff, from those places into early literacy or from the general fund into early literacy. All right. Any questions?
Can you go back to the Title I funding? How much, what's the percentage in terms of the Title I funding? If we get it or don't get it, how much is that in relation to the budget? How much of those funds are Title I funds?
That's a great question. I think I'd have to, unless
I think it's about 2.8.
title funds.
I think so.
Okay.
2.8 to 3.0 maybe.
Yeah, we'll get that number for you after this. Sure.
Dan, I can not answer the numbers question, but I can tell you that Title I funds, IDEA funds, and the funds that we get out of school lunch, those are the three largest of about 18 buckets, I think, is the total number of buckets that we have from federal dollars. The total amount for this fiscal year, for the current year, is about $16 million for all of those. And those three constitute about 85 to 90% of those funds. And so there's McKinney-Vento, there's some E-rate, and there's some others that are smaller buckets, Medicaid funding, that also could be potentially impacted. But the largest ones, school lunch is by far the largest for us. It's a little over 6 million. The next two are Title I and the IDEA. And so on the overall budget, I think we ran these numbers a while back for this question, and I think all federal dollars make up about 6%, 6.5% of our total funding.
Thank you, Dr. Cook. Expenditures or assumptions, excuse me. So personnel expenditures make up 85% of the general fund operations budget. This number is consistent with last year. School personnel is based off staffing ratios, and they're applied to projected enrollment. Operational personnel has historically been held flat or reduced. In fiscal year 25-26 proposed general fund, the operations budget includes a $196 million in personnel appropriations. That's a 9% increase over fiscal year 24-25. And we'll talk about how we come up with that 9% increase, what makes up that increase. And then the fiscal year 25-26 proposed personnel budget, it does not have any cushion. It includes a larger than prior year vacancy estimate to ensure reserve estimates are accurate. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. As we started going from the requested budget to the proposed budget, I started having meetings with our budget officer and superintendent, Dr. Cook, and it became clear to me that without making substantial cuts to this, even with making substantial cuts to materials and services, we were going to have to start cutting personnel. And so that was what it looked like with the requested budget as we built in our typical cushion that we would for personnel. Myself and Nick went back and looked and said, hey, you know, has this cushion been too much? Can we tighten up that cushion? And we actually found that it had been. We'd basically not been putting in enough vacancy savings, and we'd been rolling over $2 million in personnel and fund balance. So instead of rolling that over this year, we do not expect to have that. We increased the vacancy savings, which lowers the total personnel appropriation. So what I'm trying to say here is we have a very tight budget, and we did that to ensure that we weren't putting in any extra fluff that could accidentally get our people cut, if that makes sense. And so that's an important concept to understand. So I'll just pause there and see if anybody wants to have any questions or clarify.
I just want to draw your attention to what Dan just said. And this is a substantial course change from historic years because we had the luxury of being able to kind of like, it's not by design, it's by nature. When you employ as many people as we do, you're going to have some savings in turnover. You're going to, as people move into positions, move out of positions, there's those gaps of a couple of months, things like that. Those vacancy savings actually add up annually to an amount that can be predictably a fair amount of money. And one of the things that we committed to this year, and kudos to Dan and Nick for this, was, look, we're going to do everything we can to try to build a budget that doesn't require us to cut personnel. And so eating into that and not using that cushion, if you will, anticipating that we would have a similar kind of year in that savings, putting that into the budget in a way that we're, rather than building that in as a cushion and then coming in and with a $2 million increase in fund balance at the year, trying to hold on to positions that we're effectively would have cut in previous years based upon this year's data, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Typically at the end of the year, we come in about 98% budget to actuals on personnel. And that's because we didn't load in enough vacancy savings. And that's also a very common budgetary technique. It's probably very prudent actually to have that. But going into this year, we think that we'll land very close to 100% budget to actuals. And as Dr. Cook was saying, if we built in that cushion, it would have shown that we had $2 million less in reserves. And so we would have had to effectively cut out $2 million more in personnel. So. Okay.
A quick question.
Sure.
The 9% increase, how much of that is accounted for by wage increases for staff that are on board versus numeric increase in staff?
Yeah, so it is almost all going to be accounted for based on COLA steps. We did not, I think we increased 2 positions this entire year. And so moving forward, actually to talk about what Chair Eisenberg was just talking about was the major personnel expenditure assumptions in fiscal year 25-26 proposed. So there's the ongoing PERS rates increases of 4.1% or 4.6 million. And last year, I think when Brad was sitting here, our former CFO, we were projecting closer to like a 2%, maybe a 3% increase. Unfortunately, those rates came in substantially higher. I think we were projecting as a dollar amount that it would be around a $3 million hit. This is much closer, a $4.6 million hit. And of course, that's a continuing cost that we'll need to absorb year over year. We put in about a 2.4 increase in annual steps for employees. About half of our employees are eligible for steps still. Another half of them have kind of hit their max step. There's a moderate cost of living adjustment, which is currently being negotiated as part of bargaining. So I won't be saying out loud what our budget number is, but I will say that I think that this is what we as administration think that we will likely come to agreement with our bargaining. There's also a moderate insurance cap increase, which is currently being negotiated as part of bargaining. We did, as I just spoke to at depth, increase our vacancy savings projection, which reduced the total personnel appropriations. And before I move on to other operating cost assumptions, are there any questions about the PERS assumptions? Because these are really the assumptions that make up 85% of our expenditures in our operating budgets.
So Dan, as we think about these large PERS increases and what the Ways and Means Committee is proposing, is it essentially a funding cut, what they're proposing, given all of these other increases in costs?
That's a great question. I mean, 11.4 is certainly an increase over the prior biennium, but yes, this is these costs we don't have the dollars really to cover. I mean, it's going to continue to eat into our bottom line year over year more than anticipated. We certainly saw our PERS side accounts and our PERS bonds coming to an end, so we knew there was going to be some kind of increase. This is larger than we anticipated, and I think because we invested in some of those things, though, we did save a lot of money. I think there's other districts like Crook County and even some of our other regional districts that you'll hear about that were really hit a lot harder on these PERS, but certainly it's up to debate if the SSF funding can cover the increased cost of personnel year over year.
And obviously,
I would like to also answer
Yeah.
that question. Yes.
Okay.
That's a more direct answer. Yeah.
And obviously, there's so much market volatility. Do we expect like that? Is that going to impact PERS rates and drive up our costs even more?
Well, I don't know that volatility alone does. I mean, if volatility leads to decreased market, which it typically would, decreased market returns, then certainly our PERS costs would go unfunded. Our unfunded actual liability would increase for PERS, and we would end up paying more over the years. But those things are usually projected out over a number of years, so we'll just kind of have to see where we land on that. But it's something we're monitoring closely.
And I would just add that the unfunded liability for school districts are anticipated to increase for about the next 6 to 8 years as we are trying to true up. I mean, the number of Tier 1 PERS retirees are increasing, and there's going to be a point at which those Tier 1 retirees will stop drawing as much money over time, or Tier 2. Which is still a little better than Tier 1. I mean, a little less than Tier 1. And then the rest of us that are in the, 12-year or less boat, our OPSERP is that's the model that they're trying to get to, kind of this liquidity. And so right now, it looks like about 8 years that districts are going to have increasing unfunded expectations with PERS just to be able to make the budget work. And so you'll hear that over and over and over to be able to cover those retirement costs.
And I'll just add on to that. There's two reasons why the cost went up from our projected kind of 2 or 3% to 4.1%. And the reasons are, one, yes, correct, Director Tatum, the market did not return as it was supposed to at the end of the biennium 25 for those first PERS bonds. And we saw an increase in hiring more than projected by the actuaries, so more people entered into the retirement system as well. And then as Dr. Cook put, we are heavily weighted towards the top end of PERS Tier 1, so. Right. Major operating cost assumptions in the fiscal year 25-26 budget include liability insurance increase of 22%. We've had basically, not just our district, but a lot of districts have had some fairly large liability incidents, whether it's on the capital side or on the personnel side, and premiums are going up for all of us in the pool at this point in time. And I would not be surprised if this is more than a one-year thing and continues for a couple years. Reduction in computer hardware cost due to switching to a lease module for iPads, and so we'll talk about that here in a second, but that's one of the things that we did to try to free up cash flow this fiscal year. Okay, so moving on to requested versus proposed budgets in the fiscal year 25-26. So just an overview for the requested budget, department heads and level leaders meet with finance to evaluate current year expenditures and prioritize appropriations for next fiscal year budget. And so this way finance isn't making large sweeping choices. We're actually getting input from our operational leaders to see where they need increases in appropriation. And so finance goes ahead and makes a budget based on those meetings. It's called the requested budget or the initial budget, and it's based on departments' wants and needs. And then finance evaluates if the requested budget can be balanced with sufficient reserves for cash flow and emergency funding. For fiscal year 25-26, the requested budget could not be balanced while maintaining adequate reserves. And so that's one of the changes between the requested budget and the proposed budget, is we had to balance it, obviously. So the requested budget needed to be reduced by approximately $3 million to balance. Operational departments cut over $1 million in the current year, and they did that really by switching from a buy-to-own model of iPads to a lease-to-own or a lease model of iPads, and it's not a long-term savings. It is really a cash flow short-term savings. Instead of those leases being $2 million in this, or those ownership costs of iPads being $2 million in this current year, we're able to lease for about $500,000, but then next year the lease will be $1 million, the following year $1.5 million. And so there will not be a long-term savings there, but there is some free up of short-term cash which was needed. And we did all these changes, and also our operations departments cut about $2 million in fiscal year 25-26 expenditures to balance the budget, really to make sure that we can have as little to no impact on school staffing or discretionary budgets. And our COO, Paul Dean, is in the back of the room, and just thank you, Paul, for working with finance and working with all the departments and taking on a lot of these cuts. Appreciate that. So the reductions included leased iPads, reduced travel and professional development, and that was not just through operational departments, but through TLC, student services, policy and advocacy. We did cut professional development in quite some ways. We had decreased utilities usage, water. So in an effort, again, to retain staff, we can expect that in the summer our grass will not be as green as it's been. And we had substantial supplies reductions, and we deferred maintenance projects to future years. And so that's kind of how we cut $2 million out of the budget for fiscal year 25-26. I think it's probably an understatement to say that we reduced materials and services budgets below optimal appropriations. They're kind of cut down about as far as you can do without having major operational issues, I would say. Should, and this goes back to a question from the Budget Committee Chair, should SSF revenue come in at $11.4 billion as opposed to $11.6 billion, the district will need to make an additional $3 million in expenditure cuts. And at this point in time, I don't believe that operations or operational departments would be able to absorb those reductions. So should that happen, we'd be looking at cutting personnel. And I think we're starting to have meetings with our executive team about priorities and those sorts of things, about what would have the least impact for our students and for our schools in those cuts. So, but we're obviously very hopeful, and we believe that we will be able to get to that $11.6 billion SSF statewide. Any questions, comments?
Can you talk about the deferred maintenance and what criteria that looks like?
Yeah, so deferred maintenance projects are projects that aren't covered from our capital fund. They're not new construction. It would be like, for instance, next year up on the docket, I believe is like 400,000 to take out super old carpet in Jewel Elementary School. And so these kind of things, they have a life cycle, and you're supposed to do them every 10 years, every 15, every 20 years. And when I'm saying deferring it, we chose not to put some of those things in the budget and push them back in an attempt to retain staff. Yep. Okay, so there's a lot going on in this graph, but it's a very important graph. It is our future years forecast, resources versus requirements. So the resources are the blue bar, and the requirements are the red bar, and that's also known as expenditures. And then the yellow line here is our actual ending fund balance. You can think of that as a reserve level. And then the gray line is our reserve requirement. And you can see that this year, our projected ending, the red bar in FY25 is going to be slightly larger than the blue bar. And we spent a lot of time on this where we feel pretty confident that our expenditures are going to slightly increase over our revenues this year. And so we will lose a little bit of ending fund balance. We will drop our actual ending fund balance this year. Looking at fiscal year 26, if you were to look at the proposed budget and the ending fund balance, the beginning fund balance in 26 and the ending fund balance in 25 would match, but you'd see that the beginning fund balance in 26, if you subtract it from the ending fund balance, there's a gap, there's a large drop, and that's what that drop is in the yellow line heading towards our reserve requirement. And at the current personnel assumptions, which I have said are just moderate assumptions, we do, and not adding staff, we do anticipate that by fiscal year 27, we would be at a reserve balance of about $5 million by the end of fiscal year 27 without making significant expenditure management changes. And our reserve requirement would be about $13 million at that time just to make payroll. I mean, that's the smallest cash flow. The thing that's a little bit tough about this is fiscal year 27 is the second year of the biennium. There really isn't that much uncertainty about revenues, or we will know our SSF allocation. Maybe there'll still be some uncertainty about federal revenues, but we would really need to have substantial increases in revenue, potentially new revenue, or significant expenditure management, the likes of which we have not seen. I think we talked about, Brad talked about maybe having to do that this year. Luckily, the SSF was increased over that projection, but we are looking to have to make those changes in fiscal year 27 at this point in time in order to make sure that those yellow lines and gray lines never cross, because that would just not be something that's not sustainable for our district. And I'm happy to go into more detail on this, but I'm just going to open it up for questions. Okay. So then I'll just kind of leave off with, due to the impending funding cliff, which we do believe is real, and we've looked at our actuals over and over, and we think that's what we're looking at here. We have a general fund operational reserve appropriation of approximately 8% in the proposed budget, and this is to slightly mitigate the impact of expenditures outpacing revenues in future years, so that ultimately the expenditure management decisions we have to make in the next year might not be as great as they are. So that's kind of the prudent fiscal budgeting thing to do, and that's what we're looking at. All right, any questions?
I just want to remind folks that this was strategically, while this is not the most optimum budget proposal, that this is exactly what we were expecting coming off the ESSER cliff. And we were buying ourselves time and trying to stretch out this fact that expenditures and revenues were out of alignment, and buying more time and making small changes and cuts. If you recall, 2 years ago, that budget we proposed, we had 53 positions that we reduced. And this year, it was really intentional to try to work on areas that were not staffing as we try to reduce and get into a better alignment. There are lots of factors that Dan hasn't really gone into that I think are important when it comes to like why our enrollment is what it is, and that this is something that is being experienced, both enrollment and revenue across the state. This will be a common conversation. You will hear this from many school districts. We're either going to need to have another revenue source or mitigate our expenditures in some fashion in the next 2 years substantially to get into a better kind of sustainable model. And that we are just like every other district in the state when that comes to it. Some percentage of districts have a local option levy to help bolster against that, or a large fund balance. I can tell you that we've been running into lots and lots of unfunded mandates that are continuing to chip away at what we talk about. For example, a really great program that is supporting a lot of workers across the state, Paid Leave Oregon. At any given point in our district, around 275 to 300 people are availing themselves of that access to that at any given point. And that's not, you don't see the cost in them using that. You see those costs in us needing to hire and replace those positions through substitutes. And so, and not $1 was allocated when that was presented by the state of Oregon. And so that's just one example. I can give you lots and lots more, but I just want to, this is a budget that we feel good about, we feel proud about, we feel like we've done a nice job squeezing everything we can out of this turnip so that we can hold on to positions, but we've got a tough 2 years ahead of us if something doesn't change.
And if I recall, Steve, we've had the conversation about going way beyond the 5% fund balance. That 5% is the requirement, but we're looking hopefully at bringing that back up. Maybe I heard 8, 10. But this is not the this is not the biennium to do that, obviously.
I think that would be very prudent. As I look at things, our cash flow needs are probably more than 5% anyways, with the way we've structured things to have 3 checks in June go out. So I think that would probably be very prudent. One of our financial strategic initiatives is to get you an analysis of that. I will say that there are other districts that have larger reserve levels, including Portland, which is all the way up to 10%. And then just a point of clarification, I just wanted to say that we did not cut any staff from this budget, but due to decreasing enrollment, we did have a natural reduction in some staff. And so there's a difference between the two, but because our staffing ratios, we were overstaffed when we go down 200 students, so we did make a couple natural reductions there.
I just want to remind folks on what the kind of the machination of how that happens. You know, we hire to enrollment, and then ebbs and flows come in the fall where we overshoot or we undershoot and we have to move people around. We might have to hire a few more positions. And so there's this percentage of employees. We tend to be about 2,000 employees, a little over 2,000 employees. There's this percentage that are in on temporary hires. And there's not an expectation that those jobs are continuing because of the circumstances in those hires. And so there's this, you know, when you get into the probably somewhere around 97% and higher, those last 3% of our employees are in a situation like that. So it gives us some flexibility. Now Steve Herron would be twitching in the back if he were here right now, the way I'm talking about that. Like, they still have some rights, and we have to make sure that we're treating them effectively. And we can't do that with them year after year after year before they're treated like an employee that has due process rights as far as continuing contract rights. But that is a natural part of the process, is that we have to make those, you know, kids don't come to us in packages of 24 and then we hire a new teacher. And so we're constantly maneuvering that to fill out how we're going to serve our 16,700 to 17,000 students.
Okay. One of the main goals of the budget document and this budget committee is to make sure that our financials are transparent and that they're well communicated to you and to our stakeholders, the community. So with that being in mind, questions outside of this meeting, please direct them to blsbudget@ben.k12.or.us, and we'll answer all of those questions. So before we meet again in May, and we'd love to hear from from any of you with those questions. So thank you. Any other questions related to the presentation before I go ahead and pass it off to Dr. Burke for strategic initiatives? Well, thank you for your time. Thank you for your volunteer.
Okay, so part of the conversation around budget is, well, the main reason that we have a budget is because we're doing something with it. We have like needs and things that we're thinking about. And so Sean and Joel, would you be able to put up that document? So this document kind of outlines, what do we care about here? What are the things that we are spending our time and energy on? Knowing that both of those are kind of limited quantities, and so we need to be really focused with what our initiatives are in Ben Lapine. When we talk about doing something like school, there are a billion things that go into the idea of school and what makes schools great. But our board of directors has outlined really what are our main goals. And Steve referred to those in the opening budget statement, which is the first, having a strong academic core. The second, having our students leave our buildings with a passion, purpose, and plan. The third, that all of our stakeholders experience wellness, inclusion, and belonging. And finally, our last page is just related to what we call strategic supports, but really it's about all of the systems that we have in place: transportation, finances, policy, all of those things that allow us to do the work within schools around academics well. So when we look at any of these strategic initiatives that the board of directors set out, there are some big rocks that we're trying to move within those. So as we talk about a strong academic core, in the elementary as well as secondary, we are consistently adopting, as state mandates ask us to, new curriculum, and we are learning that and implementing that. So becoming good at new curricula takes some time and energy, but that's something that we're deeply engaged in. So that's something that's related to strong academic core. Secondarily, standards-based instruction and grading is an initiative that is throughout our secondary system. Our elementary really operates under this purview already. But as we move toward a standards-based instruction and grading, we're really trying to reduce the variability of grading systems within all of our schools and reduce the variability of what standards students are learning in each of our classrooms. So these are big initiatives. These are like 5-year long and more in some cases initiatives. The third one in that line is instructional techniques. And really that is a nod toward the diversity that we experience with our learners in the classroom. So students who are very well practiced in things need different types of instruction than those who are emergent in their learning, who needs different instruction than those who maybe are experiencing multilingual opportunities in their home life and at school. So we've got a diversity that we are trying to tap into, and that requires our teachers to know and recognize that and then be able to adapt to that within the classroom. Within passion, purpose, and plan, this is probably holding beyond sort of our general fund allocation of teachers or individuals. This is probably holding the majority of those that are related to like personnel asks. So when we think about life and career readiness and having students have this kind of a plan moving forward, we need people to really be meeting with students and help them along their path. So those are things like counselors. Counseling in our school district has not always been something that was experienced at each of our schools. And so throughout the past few years, we've definitely ramped up that initiative. Also having teachers who are able to adapt to some of our behavioral needs and mental health needs that we're seeing within our schools, that's all part of that life and career readiness goal. MTSS refers to multi-tiered systems of support. And really this is allowing us to have a mechanism that quickly helps us recognize who is at risk for not meeting any one of these needs. So this is related to up there Synergy module. So this is a tech module that was purchased that allows us to look at grades, attendance, and grades, attendance, and behavior throughout the year consistently, so that we can recognize, oh, this student is falling through the cracks. We need something in place right now. How can we support expeditiously and with like the least amount of power necessary to sort of get people on track? And finally, in our last area of wellness, inclusion, and belonging, this is pointing to all of our efforts related to shoring up and reducing variability across our schools in terms of how we respond to disruptive behavior. So when we talk about a code of conduct, it is having some consistency with the way in which we enforce behavioral expectations throughout our schools. Similarly, Tier 1 expectations is that work of it's kind of a joint partnership between all of our associations and our administrative team to be able to come together and deliver consistent messages on what do we expect within our schools and how will we respond when those criteria are not met. The last component of wellness, inclusion, and belonging has happened already over the past few years in Ben Lapine, but it really is recognizing whose voices are at the table, what areas do we need to kind of beef up, who are we listening to when we ask, how can we do better, how are we serving you? And we've done this in a variety of ways. This is our work across our district, consistent survey asks of our community so that we have kind of real-time data that we can respond to. And then we've also ramped up the ideas related to focal groups of families and students, as well as employee focal groups that have started this year. So we're doing a lot with these dollars that we put in place here. And unfortunately, as you'll hear as kind of a consistent mantra, is the cost of the people that it takes to do this work is increasing, and the dollars aren't increasing at the same time. And so although we want to consistently move these rocks, we are not interested in changing these rocks, but we are interested in thinking about what things might we need to alter so that we can continue on the path forward. You will hear with a certain degree of consistency tonight that our system, our teachers, our staff, our students are consistently calling for fewer things that we're focusing on. And as we look at what's up there, I don't think I can point to any one of those that I could say, nah, we're not going to do that. This is like the fewest number of things that we can truly say with confidence that we're doing good things for students in our schools. But that does mean that we have an interest in not recreating the wheel every year, but keeping on the path because we've got speed bumps to hit along the way. So this continues to be something that we've used all year. We'll continue to use this for the next several years. Just for your knowledge, this will become a public-facing document. It's sort of in the works right now, but over time, this will become public-facing such that any community member could click on any one of those icons to say, what does that mean? And then within that, it says, why do we care about this? And how does this align with our equity stance? And who does this affect? And how does this influence our organization? So I guess all of what I'm speaking to today, I want y'all to know that we are very focused. We are very interested in moving these rocks for students because we think it's the right thing to do. And we appreciate your time and energy as you look at the ways that we can allocate our funds to get these things done.
That's our presentation for the Budget Committee.
It was great, thank you. Dan, is there a deadline when you would like the questions to you and Nick by?
No, that's a great question. I think probably just stopping the week before the vote from the pros to the approve will give us enough time to answer those questions.
And I personally think it would be amazing if we could all see the questions and answers that are submitted so we can all learn together.
Yes.
So if that's possible, that would be wonderful.
We will BCC the entire budget committee, board included, so not just residents, but elected officials.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Actually, let's talk just a little bit about the process. One of the things that we want to make sure of is that the questions are available. And so we will provide all of the questions and answers as we'll collect them. And up until May 6th, is that the day, May 6th? If you have questions, please submit to that email. And we will gather those all up and summarize those and place them all in a document that will be a part of the process as well. And so what's the plan for how we're going to get immediate response? Are we going to try to do those all, collect them all, and then make sure? Is that the?
I mean, for an immediate response, I was thinking we would BCC the entire, but then we can collect them all and put them in as part of the consent agenda.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
That's great, thank you. Is there anything else that anyone needs to bring up? Okay. Thank each of you for your attendance this afternoon. The next Budget Committee meeting is scheduled for May 13th, 2025 at 5 p.m. And with that said, this meeting is adjourned.